And for those of you that say, well, it really doesn't impact me, I don't care if Trump goes to prison. Well, first of all, you absolutely should care. Because if we lose, they're going to come after the churches, they're going to come after the organizations, they're going to come after the people, they're going to come after the social media accounts, they're going to come after the bank accounts, they're going to come after every single person that played any form and role into trying to defend President Trump, with social media banning, following in the streets, targeting in every form and fashion. If we lose, if the president loses, they will come for us all. They will come for your children, they will come for your schools, they will come in every fashion. And they won't stop. They are going to do whatever it takes to try to personally and intergenerationally destroy Donald Trump. That's how much they hate him. They hate him not because of his tweets, not because of his style. They hate him because all of their schemes have been put in jeopardy. They're going to come with bloodthirsty revenge. President Trump always says, quote,
if you love birds, you'd never want to walk under a windmill because it's a very sad, sad sight.
We are intrinsically tied to the president. He's with us. He's for us. I've called him the bodyguard of Western civilization. And boy, is he taking the body blows for us right now. But if they come for him, they're coming for us, and they're also coming for me. This is where it's headed. If Donald Trump loses, you can expect every level of power to try to obliterate us for good. This is a very real thing. If we lose in November, it's going to be bedlam. That if they get power back, they're going to lock him up, and they're going to continue until they have absolute pathological power over our country. Please email us your thoughts, as always, freedom@charliekirk.com, freedom@charliekirk.com. Make sure you check out my interview with Candace Owens, author of Blackout, phenomenal episode. Please consider supporting us at charliekirk.com/support, charliekirk.com/support. Please consider supporting us at Turning Point USA and getting involved with Turning Point USA in the Culture War, tpusa.com, tpusa.com. If you guys want to win a signed copy of the Mega Doctor, type in Charlie Kirk to your podcast provider, hit subscribe, give us a 5-star review, screenshot it, email us, freedom@charliekirk.com, freedom@charliekirk.com. Thank you guys so much for listening. God bless you. Talk to you soon.
All right. That was Ammon Animation's video, Charlie Kirk Descends into Madness. People may remember their work from the episode that we did, Jordan Peterson Wants You to Clean 12 More Rooms. The combination of right-wing figures doing their thing with the creepy Lovecraftian imagery is something that I am always a sucker for. But of course, I just saw the man himself. There's now a picture of me shaking hands with Charlie Kirk that exists somewhere. We'll be out there soon. So I just saw the man himself on Friday to do a debate at the TPUSA studio in Phoenix, Arizona, on Trumpian populism versus democratic socialism. And all jokes from that video aside, they were extremely gracious hosts, and honestly, I think he's a really good sport just for doing it. Like, most conservatives run screaming in the opposite direction from the opportunity to engage with anybody who would challenge their views. So I do think he deserves credit for that part. Said that at the very end. The debate itself is going to be out in 3 weeks because it is going to be aired as the third episode of his new show, Debate Night with Charlie Kirk. The first one is already up with Dr. Rashad Ritchie, and they're arguing about mask mandates in schools, I believe. And then there was one that they recorded a few days earlier. They're I think they're putting that one out this week. And so in any case, the way it works out, it's going to be like another 2 weeks until the episode with me comes out. And the deal was, when we all agreed to do this, that they get it first to run on the CPUSA channel, and then we get it, and also Town Circle, who set the whole thing up in the first place and raised enough money for charity to pay for meals for 11,000 people, because people really wanted to see this particular conversation happen. So Town Circle gets it, and we get it, all at the same time when it's unembargoed after they run it. So their producer told me they were going to run it on October 21st, which means that we are going to show it here as part of the episode instead of the big interview in the middle on Monday, October 25th. Now, that is 3 weeks in the future. I'm well aware that is like 10,000 years of YouTube time. Everybody's like immediately, when can I see this? And you have to wait 3 weeks, is not something people are used to hearing right now. But that is the way it works out. Like I said, I'm just glad he did it, because most of his ilk do not. But I can at least, for now, I can at least give people a general sense of what went on. Some of it ended up touching on philosophy stuff, because as we've seen in some of those previous debates that we watched on the channel, he does like to bust out some philosophical claims. There's no social contract, rights come from God, that sort of thing. So we did get into some of that stuff, and the philosophy segment with Professor Jennifer Burgess at the end of that we started doing at the end of the episode this week, next week, and the week after. Right? Yeah. Today's the 4th. So yeah, 4th, 11th, 18th. Yeah. This week, next week, the week after, we're going to be doing a 3-part series, Teaching Philosophy to Charlie Kirk, where we talk about some of the things that came up in the philosophy parts. But as far as the main sort of political part, even though the video won't be out for a few weeks, I can at least give people a general sense of what went on here, and we'll save some of the choicer morsels for the post game with patrons. But for right now, I'll just say this. So, like I said, the announced topic was Trumpian populism versus democratic socialism. He changed it to conservative populism when he set it up at the beginning. I don't know if there's some kind of pivot there, about Donald Trump as the mascot for this new conservative populism. But at the beginning, I, basically made the challenge that I really wanted to make, because this is when the people from Town Circle came to me in the first place, asked if I wanted to use their platform to challenge somebody to debate, raise money for charity to make it happen. And I said, well, do you have anybody in mind? And they said, Charlie Kirk. I have to admit, my first reaction was, okay, that's a thought, right? And then the more I started to think about it, the more it actually started to make sense to me, because, usually I end up debating libertarians because they're the people on the right who are most up for that, for whatever reason. And I'm all for that. And I imagine I'll continue to do that forever. But Charlie Kirk, his views represent the views of like a vastly bigger chunk of actually existing reactionaries than the sort of hardcore property rights libertarians do. And he's very typical of those guys, of people, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, J.D. Vance, certainly all those people have started claiming that they're not like the old kind of corporate Republicans, they're populists. And so how I framed it was basically, okay, so if you're a populist, why don't you support raising the minimum wage? Why don't you support giving everybody health care? Why don't you support making it easier for ordinary people to organize unions, so they can have a little bit of say in the workplace? And whatever you think of his answers to those questions, and people can judge for themselves in 3 weeks, I guess what I will say now before I throw to Jake is just, I think it's a win all by itself that the main part, like there was a sort of main segment in a post game, basically, that the main part was devoted to him having to give these like standard issue Reaganite arguments against raising the minimum wage and give everybody health care and make it easier to organize unions. I think that in itself is a tough fit with the populist Brandon.
Yeah. Well, I think I only myself suffered through his debate with Hassan. So that's what I'm sure that some of them went off the rails less, but it seems like from what you're saying, you were able to keep it on your own turf, or the turf you wanted it to stick on, better than, these other types of debates where he's able to just kind of go all over the place with these random statistics that he has in his little notebook. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that it was certainly more focused than the Hassan one was, for sure, actually. So yeah, I'm quite happy with that. As I said, we'll during the more informal post game with patrons later, we will talk a little bit more about some of what went on this weekend. And of course, there's we'll get into that in the Teaching Philosophy to Charlie Kirk segment at the end of the show. Meanwhile, I stayed on the topic of debates. We have some sound from a friend of the show, Sam Harris, who is actually such a friend of the show that we did a episode last season entitled "Sam Harris is Wrong About Everything." And part of the reason that we're doing this, so our graphic designer, J. Andrew World, who's going to be joining us for the next segment, is the one who kind of brought us this clip. And I have to admit, it stretches my confidence that he's wrong about everything. I think he's wrong about like 97% of everything.
But 3% of the time he's spitting facts, huh?
Yeah, 3% of the time he's not entirely wrong. Fortunately, since it would really disturb me if I completely agreed with Sam Harris about something, I think that I'm a little ambivalent about some of what he's talking about, but it's still an interesting clip. So for a little bit of context for this, for anybody who doesn't have the unhealthy fixation with his characters that I do, and I mean, like Jake, I mean, you're a union organizer, before you started doing this, and still, like, how much do you know about the characters in this saga?
Oh, not a ton, to be honest with you.
Okay, that's good.
And I'm very online, so somehow this kind of slipped under my my radar.
Yeah, that's yeah. Well, so that's healthy. That's good. To not know tons about them. Unfortunately, because of stuff we were doing for this show and before that for TMBS, when we do Harris debunks, and also helping Michael with his book Against the Web, where he has a whole long chapter on Sam Harris. I've spent way too much time thinking about Sam Harris, and even a little bit too much time thinking about Brett Weinstein. So these are two of the leading figures in a branding exercise from 2018 called the Intellectual Dark Web.
Oh, so, yes. Okay, this I know about. Okay.
Yeah, right. So the IDW, right, the Intellectual Dark Web, so which is how you always have to say it, is something I believe Brett's brother Eric originally came up with the term, but it was most popularized by empty-headed former New York Times columnist Barry Weiss. They're people I respect who think more of her than I do, but for me, the top line is always that she wrote these like weird vapid columns, and that she like sometimes claims to care a lot about free speech, which, if she really did, fair enough. I care about free speech, but also she spent a lot of time as like a college Zionist activist trying to get professors fired for being anti-Israel.
That's just speech, just more speech. Speech asking to get people fired, right? That's yeah, no contradiction there.
Yeah, fair enough. Speech asking for people to be executed for their views. It's speech. Yeah. So in any case, Barry Weiss wrote this profile in 2018 called Meet the Renegades of the Intellectual Dark Web, where she profiled this group of dudes, all dudes, Brett Weinstein and Sam Harris are the two that are going to feature in tonight's story. Our other friend Ben Shapiro, who I believe actually, as we speak, I don't think it's live anywhere. We'll have to wait for the video, but as we speak, I believe that other Ben is debating our actual friend Anna Kasparian in Los Angeles. So looking forward to breaking that down here in the future. I expect that she will wipe the floor with him. But in any case, Ben Shapiro, Sam Harris, Brett Weinstein, his brother Eric, Jordan Peterson, and a couple other guys. Weiss was not the one who wrote that article, but the New York Times really was going on a spree there, since this was around the time, yes, as Dave reminds us in the chat, that they ran an article referring to Ben Shapiro as the cool kids philosopher. So this, I mean, I'm not going to say it's the worst period of the New York Times. They did print all that Judith Miller stuff about the Iraq War, but it's not good. Let's say that, not good, bad. But in any case, yeah. So the idea was, right, the metaphor, the intellectual dark web, is that it's like going on, Silk Road to buy drugs online. That this stuff that's like just too hot for in this metaphor, the regular web that shows up in Google results. This is like the secret subversive stuff where they're going to tell you these hidden truths, which was always a weird fit with the fact that they got a glowing profile in the New York Times where they were all like doing this weird photo shoot where they're all standing around like some like shrouded in the darkness, with some like plants in the background going like this, but in any case, I would recommend anybody who wants to read all about these guys do read Michael's book, Against the Web. But this is 2018, that these sort of reactionaries, but the kind of people who mostly would say like, oh, I'm not a conservative, I'm a classical liberal, and also maybe a conservative. The big exception was Ben Shapiro, who I think would have been a more natural fit in a group that was like, I don't know, Sean Hannity and Ann Coulter or something. But other than that, right, it was mostly people like this. And the idea was they were super daring because they believed that, I don't know, gender was real or something. And since then, though, there has been a bit of a falling out. And the falling out, of course, was due to the final stages of the Trump presidency. And Sam Harris pretty much had standard, culturally liberal sort of like, blue state, professional, managerial class sort of views about all of that stuff. And which, don't get me wrong, is the lesser evil in this particular context. And some of the others, including Brett Weinstein, had a very different reaction. And Brett Weinstein got very into Trumpist conspiracy theories about the election. And he's also gotten very into COVID conspiracy theories. And that is the context of this clip.
The reason why I don't want to do a podcast with Brett and Heather is the same as why I wouldn't do a podcast with a 9/11 truth conspiracy theorist or Alex Jones or anyone in that world. Because there's a basic asymmetry which is very hard to overcome. It's so much easier to make a mess than to clean it up. It's so much easier to light several small fires than to put them out. It's like a 10-to-1 advantage. To put it that way, it sounds like my concern is not losing a debate, and that's absolutely not my concern. If you're going to view this as a debate, it's won almost immediately. But I worry about what people take from the encounter, and I just don't want to do additional harm to our public conversation about what is in fact an important public health concern and a growing political one. first, the asymmetry. The reason why there's such an asymmetry here is that it is just impossible to debunk most things in real time. And even if the point being made is in fact spurious, it won't seem spurious to 99% of an audience, right? So the person on the conspiracy theory side of things can say, well, what about the 14 CDC officials who resigned last week and wouldn't give reasons when asked? What do you make of that? Right now, there's probably nothing to be made of that, right? I didn't even hear about it. And the truth is, I just made that up. But when delivered in the context of a, quote, debate about these things, with someone whose whole angle is there's conspiracy everywhere, it can seem like, oh, you didn't know about that. Well, that's clearly a problem. You should look into that. What about the paper that just came out of Micronesia that showed ivermectin was 100% effective? I didn't see that paper out of Micronesia. Oh, you didn't? Well, okay, you should really do your homework. It's possible to just scatter a lot of dust in the eyes and ears of the audience and make it seem like there's so many anomalies out there. There's so many things that need to be explained. And if you're not going to explain those things, if you're not going to connect this particular pattern of dots, well, then you're just not doing the work. And that need not necessarily be done in bad faith. Of course, it can be, right? It's a tactic. But that's not what I'm alleging Brett and Heather would do. I'm just saying that's the way they think now. It's such a scattershot approach to this. There's so little quality control around the kind of information they're putting forward. And it takes such an effort to chase it all down and debunk it. And anything that shows up that's new in the conversation can't be tracked down in real time. So I don't have much hope that a conversation would wind up producing a document that would be good for the world.
Yeah. And here's the thing. Like, all right, it's bad enough that Sam is not wrong about like the larger thing, which is like COVID conspiracy theories are bad and dumb and dangerous. But I at least thought when I saw, when Andy brought us the clip, and I think he'd seen Sam Cedar talk about it. I think that's how it came to his attention. He's not a regular, Sam Harris, aficionado, as far as I know. But I at least thought, okay, well, I am actually going to disagree with this because I knew that the point was that he was saying that he didn't want to debate Brett Weinstein about the COVID conspiracy theories. And I kind of thought, that his reason would be the sort of standard reasons that people will give to not debate conspiracy theorists, that like, oh, you're like legitimizing it, or something like that. You're treating it as if it's up for debate and that's bad. I actually do find all of that super unconvincing. I mean, obviously, right? I mean, it wouldn't have been in Phoenix this weekend. Fun fact, actually, Charlie Kirk did. There was like a moment where he kind of hinted at some conspiracy theory stuff about COVID. It was for like 20 seconds though, and I was thinking about picking up. I was like, this is really not what I want to argue about today, right? Just let that sail by, But let's get back to the minimum wage and healthcare and all that stuff. But I obviously do generally disagree with those sorts of reasons for not debating conspiracy theories or not debating anything else. I think that the idea that we can make bad points of view go away by pretending that they're not there, I'm pretty skeptical. I don't think that really works. I mean, sometimes maybe for things that are super marginal in the sense that like hardly anyone believes them. But I think that for anything where you're already worried about a large number of people accepting something, I think just refusing to engage with it is generally a bad strategy. But I got to say, I mean, I don't know what you thought, Jake, but watching this, thought, all right, well, he's doing a lot of his Sam Harris ticks about how he's presenting it, and that annoys me. But especially at the end when he said, yeah, like a virologist, sure, right? Like I'd like a virologist to debate Brett. he's kind of right about this. Like, yeah.
No, he definitely has a point when it comes to these kinds of debates, right? We cut out that part of the clip, but he does say at the end that on issues, right, of public health or the vaccine, I'd rather have a virologist debate them. But I guess, but after your debate with Mr. Charlie, I guess one thought is if you're able to focus debate on, maybe there are ways to have productive debates with these types of people, and there are ways to not, right? So maybe he's painting with too broad of a brush there, as maybe the one.
I think that might be right. I think that, so on the one hand, like, I'm actually pretty sympathetic, like, on a personal level, to what he's saying, because I don't know, if somebody asked me to do a debate about COVID conspiracy theories, I might actually say exactly what he's saying just now. Like, don't debate me. Go find, an epidemiologist, and debate them, because, like, what the hell can I really say that's going to be going toe to toe on the details, right? I think it's good to kind of know your limits. But the reason that I'm ambivalent about it is that I think, even though I might very well say what he said here, and I think he definitely has a point about the ways that debate can go very wrong, and about how there are other people who might be better to have it. I think all of that stuff is true, right? But even so, the reason that I'm a little ambivalent is I think it's a mistake if people who aren't experts are never arguing with conspiracy theorists about this, especially because, like, just to do a very goofy analogy, apologies in advance, but, like, in this case, right, there's no stopping the spread, right? I mean, the conspiracy theories are already everywhere. At this point, like, you need to actually, do some sort of treatment or vaccine or something. Like, you can't just hope to stop it with distancing. Given that, I think it is a mistake if everybody all the time, just who's not an expert, just says, no, don't talk to me, just talk to the medical experts. Especially because, like, a big part of why, of, like, what the conspiracy theorists are saying about this stuff is that you shouldn't trust whatever, the medical establishment or something like that. And so I think probably it is good to do some debates with these people sometimes, but you want to be real careful about the ground, like the terrain on which you're having it, because I think what you need to do is just to be super honest about, look, I know you spend your entire life like glued to a computer, like reading, like just coming up with, like, talking points and little bits and pieces of data, that are supposed to support this conspiracy theory. I do not, and I'm not planning to start, so, like, I'm not going to say that I could go, like, I could tell you exactly what happened with this report, or what about the study in France that shows this or that, like, maybe, right? But, like, Sam is right about the problem with doing factual debunking on the spot. That, like, sometimes you could do a little bit of that in a debate, like, especially if it's like some super common talking point that you've heard 100 times before and you kind of know it's going to come up. But, like, really, what are you going to do? Just, like, stop while you Google it and, and look at it and say, well, that doesn't sound quite right. You'd Google a couple other things and, like, 10 minutes later, you'd have a good response, but, like, you can't really do that in a live debate, which is actually why I think generally the least interesting thing to do in a live debate is to spend all of your time arguing about the empirical facts, which, you're not in a great position to do at that moment, and people following along can't check right that second, like, without losing what you're saying. You're much better off focusing on the arguments about how the different pieces connect. So I do think that. But that said, I think that like there's probably some value in doing like a really open and honest debate with a conspiracy theorist where you acknowledge that you're not going to be able to follow them down all those rabbit holes. But what you argue about is like what's generally the best way of trying to figure out what's true about stuff like this. Does it make sense for everybody to quote unquote do your own research about incredibly complicated factual issues, or does it actually make a lot more sense if you spend your to have a epistemic division of labor? Like some people can become experts on this thing, they'll report back to me, and some people become experts on that thing, they'll report back. And that doesn't mean that you have to take things absolutely on faith. That if like the connections between the things that they're saying don't make sense, we can argue about that. But generally speaking, are you better off when it comes to a purely factual issue? We're not talking about values. We're not talking about what we should do given these facts, but just like, what are the basic medical facts, right? Is it better to sort of try to cobble that together from some combination of, YouTube and Reddit and the Weinstein family, or is it better to try to figure out what the consensus is of people who actually spend their lives studying that?
Yeah, I don't know, Ben. That's a good question. I'm still doing my own personal research, and when I'm done, I'll get back to you. But this could take some time. So
yeah, fair enough. And I mean, there are interesting questions here because, like, I think that a lot of liberals like take the core of what I just said and go way too far with it, and everything they want to be like a technocratic expertise issue, when really a lot of things are about conflicted interests and conflicted ideologies, and so there are questions about where to draw the line there. But like, if you're going to defer to experts about anything, it should be like medical science.
No, and I face this with arguing with anti-vaccine people I know that are coming from a good place. I've faced this too, where it's like they're like, I don't trust elites, and I'm like, I'm right there with you, right? But I do trust these medical elites, right? So it does become a more nuanced conversation.
No, that's right. But if you could have a conversation about that like, I think that's the terrain in which it might make sense to debate conspiracy theorists, not having a conversation about, what about, do you hear about these results about ivermectin in India? And, what about, this study, this one place that said that? And, what about the dissonance, from the World Health Organization panel and whatever the fuck you've never heard of and I've never heard of. Like, that probably is not productive. For that, I think Sam Harris, I hate to use these words in this order, is probably right. But for the conversation, but I think it is probably productive to debate them on the topic of how is it that all of us as non-experts should try to figure these things out. When does it make sense to defer to experts? When doesn't it? I think that's probably useful. Also, though, I know I should give, for the sake of equal time, I should give the counter argument to my claim that before we go to the next segment, my claim that you shouldn't get your information about this from YouTube, Reddit, and the Weinstein family. And the counter argument is that according to Brett Weinstein, his family's insights, his brothers, I think there might be somebody else, would have won them like 20 Nobel Prizes, if not for the something called the distributed idea suppression complex. So maybe you should actually get all your information about this from them after all. All right. We are going to bring on our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World, and we are going to talk about what, if it happens, could be the biggest strike in the United States in 14 years, I believe. So, no, 7 years. Anyway, quite, some number of years. I don't know. This is why you should get your information about these things from YouTube. But I'm questioning my mental arithmetic. But the biggest strike in a very long time. So I think maybe to set this up, there is another video that Andy brought us. This one is so it is from the animators portion of this union. Maybe we should start off with that clip.
What's going on? What's a strike authorization? What is IATSE? What's the AMPTP? How does this affect me?
Deep breaths. I'm your studio shop steward. Let me explain. IATSE is the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees and is made up of 12 districts that encompass the U.S. and Canada. Local 839, or more popularly known as the Animation Guild, or TAG, is a local of IATSE and part of District 2, which covers Arizona, California, Hawaii, and Nevada. IATSE bargains with the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, or AMPTP, around every 3 years in order to sign a collective bargaining agreement, or CBA. The AMPTP is a trade association that represents American television and film production companies in collective bargaining negotiations within the entertainment industry.
A collective bargaining agreement? Is that like a contract?
Yuppers! The Collective Bargaining Agreement, or CBA, is a written legal contract between an employer and a union representing the employees.
Why are they striking if they're still negotiating?
A strike authorization is not a strike. It's a democratic vote of all members within a bargaining unit, or BU. A strike cannot happen unless there is a full strike authorization vote and at least 75% of members voting must agree for a vote to be successful. This is the members giving the union the power to strike if the union decides it is necessary to protect their members.
Yeah. So first things first. So the strike authorization vote they're talking about in that video happened. How did it go?
It went really well. About 90% of the union showed up, and about it was like 94%, if I remember correctly. I know. There we go.
Even higher.
Voted yes. Yeah, I was going on the safe side. 98.68% said yes, with an 89.66% turnout, which is massive, considering there are over 60,000 members to this union. You're muted.
That is really amazing. I think that given the general level, and I know some people might kind of tune out when they hear, okay, this is Hollywood, whatever. But we could get in maybe to some of the complaints of these workers. But I mean, I think the biggest thing is that think about the general level of the labor movement in the United States in year of our 2021. A strike by 60,000 people would be a big thing. We are not that is not the kind of thing that we are used to seeing.
No, and it's super exciting because these aren't just these are the people that make these productions possible. These are not just the graphic designers, the animators, the storyboard artists, the production designers, illustrators, my brethren, but they also cover people who do lighting stuff, actual, people who run stage things and actual productions on that side of things, video editors. So basically it's the people who make these things happen, which is a big deal, and it's super excited to hear about this.
Yeah, no, and I would just add, just because it's a glamorous industry. I mean, as probably a lot of people know, that the hours working on film sets, right, are just ridiculous. And also, if people are wanting to know a little bit about the conditions, learn a little bit more about the conditions that led to the strike, Alex Press wrote a really good interview with a television makeup artist talking about the working conditions. And also what's interesting in this article is how, COVID really did play a big role, at least anecdotally, in contributing to this kind of overwhelming strike vote. So in thinking about how COVID is changing labor labor conflicts on the ground, it's interesting to see it already kind of bearing fruit.
Yeah, can
And
you?
can also,
Sorry, Jake. Can you just expand on that a little bit? How COVID has played into this?
Sure. Well, what they talked about in the article is that, from a COVID, well, there's two things. First, from a COVID safety perspective, I think, they just was very, very poor, right? And that, you, especially if you're doing makeup, you can imagine how difficult it is to really be protected, right? Also, in terms of COVID compliance, the woman she interviewed discussed how they made a joke like, yeah, I bet we're going to have some PA that we come on bringing minimum wage to do like an hour training course. And it's like, nope, that's what happened. Like exactly what they joked about. So it's the compliance was, a bit of a farce. And then the third, the other part, which is with COVID and productions being shut down, people have some time maybe to think, is this the kind of life that I want to lead, right? And they were all, productions were shut down for a while. And then she said a lot of people left, but then people that did come back, they started to think, not only am I coming back, but I'm also coming back into a dangerous situation, right? So we already see how COVID, for many reasons, is causing tons of people to change careers, right? So this kind of reckoning in society, I guess, really rocked the members of IATSE as well. That's what I gather from the article so far, but definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, and I think just to maybe put a different kind of emphasis on what you're saying, like I kind of joked earlier, some people hear Hollywood and tune out, but it's like it's a glamorous industry. That does not mean these are particularly glamorous jobs.
No, and CWA, the union I work for, we recently, or a couple of years ago, organized parking attendants who work on television productions, like helping figure out the street parking and stuff like that. And yeah, I mean, these are big television productions. They're talking about how they're peeing in bottles, and but much even worse than that. Their conditions were terrible. So if you think the top of the line, the A-listers are making millions of dollars, and the people who are actually holding it together, it's just as brutal as probably any other line of work, if not worse in some instances.
Yeah, and just two things. There's actually a great Instagram page, which you couldn't access most of today since Instagram was down, but go check that out. Where you can actually see people actually tell these horror stories. And the other thing too is like there are people who really care about these people. Like for example, Danny Trejo, like in most interviews I've ever read of him, he's always like, why do I do these bad movies? It's so these people who work on the lower end stuff, they have a job. And like, so he Danny Trejo and so some of these people actually really do care about the people that are worked on, because they are shat on by people like I can't think of that producer that just came out where he was like apparently abusive to his employees who worked with Aaron Sorkin. But it's like there's tons of stories like this. That's just one of many. Whether it be Weinstein, because Weinstein's terrible no matter what Weinstein family we're talking about or whatever. That they're going to be.
Yeah, the Hollywood one is actually worse than the conspiracy kook one. But yes, none of them are good.
No, I've never to meet a good. I would like to meet a good Weinstein, but that hasn't happened yet. But anyways, there's a lot of abuse in Hollywood, and these are the people who get the abuse piled onto them for the most part.
Yeah. Exactly. So there is a petition I know that you can sign. They are still looking for non-member, support to just kind of show how widespread that is. We'll try to find a link to that and stick it in the episode description. And we will generally keep tabs on this. I actually heard about this the first time I was having like actually after the show last week, had a FaceTime whiskey with my younger brother, who is a screenwriter, among other things, and he was telling me about this and kind of put it into context of a lot else that's going on there. DSA-LA has actually been like kind of shockingly politically effective in a lot of ways. In terms of going after city council races and stuff. So good things happening in La La Land, and with any luck, some measure of justice for these workers who are peeing into bottles to get the keep the gears moving for those shows. All right. So last thing I want to do before we go to the interview with one of our favorite guests, Lillian Cicerchia, is I want to talk about the class that I am teaching for the next 8 Sundays at Michael Albert's School for Social and Cultural Change. The name of the class is Analytic Marxism and the Materialist Theory of History. And this is something that actually I get into this a little bit in the interview with Lillian. I actually started thinking about this a little bit more because I was writing this book about Christopher Hitchens, which is kind of a weird connection. But I was kind of thinking about what was wrong with some of the late Hitchens stuff about new atheism. And I think that a lot of what's wrong with it is that even though, weirdly enough, even after he kind of abandoned socialist politics, Hitchens continued to claim to believe in the materialist theory of history. In a lot of ways, the new atheism stuff was the furthest thing imaginable from the materialist theory of history. It was, what's, like the subtitle of Hitchens's 2008 book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, right? That like what's doing the poisoning isn't economic structures, it's the ideas in people's heads. And thinking about that a little bit more, made me really want to do a deep dive into what one of my very favorite philosophers, G.A. Cohen, had written about this topic. He has this classic book called Karl Marx's Theory of History, a defense, and it's very clear. He's a very very good writer, especially for an academic philosopher. And he has this great thing in the introduction where he talks about some of the experiences that got him to try to argue for and explicate what he took to be the core of Marx's theory of history in a little bit of a different way than they usually are, because he says in there that Cohen is somebody who grew up in the this kind of working class Jewish communist household in Montreal, grew up going to this communist elementary school until it was raided by the Montreal police red squad and shut down. So he came out of those roots, but then he ended up studying at Oxford, doing analytic philosophy, and he kind of talks in that introduction about the way that he wanted to do this no bullshit version of the Marxist theory of history, where you don't just sort of say this cloud of verbiage that sounds sort of impressive, but you're really, really clear about what your arguments are. What's the claim? Why should anybody believe this? What are some distinctions we can make? And he talks about going from writing like a poet who, sort of writes down anything that sounds good to writing like that, right? And I think the book really comes out of that. So in this course, the class sessions are going to be on Sunday afternoons, EST, because that's the time that's best for 1 to 3 EST, because that's the time that's best for people in a variety of time zones. If you're in California, it's 10 in the morning, which is not too bad. If you're in the UK, it's 6 at night, which is still not too bad when it starts. So it's going to be the next 8 Sundays starting next Sunday. People can sign up for that at SSCC, School for Social and Cultural Change, sscc.teachable.com. And in the conversation you're about to watch with Lillian, She is at the Free University of Berlin. So speaking of time zones, she could not do an interview at 9 at night our time. That's why this is pre-recorded. And in the interview, like, we do a really deep dive. And I know this is like 2 episodes of like pretty heavy Marxist theory stuff in a row after Vivek Chipper last time. We'll, I promise we'll do an episode on James Lindsay or something soon, but but we do a pretty deep dive on the stuff that basically on the debates going on right now within Marxists about the theory of history. Like, a lot of this is stuff that happened since Cohen wrote the book and is kind of informed by the book, but but people sort of saying, okay, on reflection, Cohen has given this like really clear explication of the kind of classic version of the Marxist theory of history. And having made it this clear, can we now see that there are problems? If there are problems, are there ways to fix them while still retaining the basic insights of the theory? And that's what we're doing a deep dive on in this conversation. But what I'd like to urge, and not just as a plug for my class, is that you gotta crawl before you can walk. If you want to be in a position to like really understand the stuff well enough to weigh in a good way on the kinds of debates that I'll be previewing with Lillian, you got to start by having a good handle on like the classic form of the Marxist theory of history, which is, I think, what Cohen really gives you and what we're going to be getting into in the class. We're going to be doing the first half of the book. I'd be very open to doing an advanced class where we go through the second, but I just want to make sure we have time to like really go through all the arguments in there and make sure everybody's getting it. So that's the classic version. And once you've done the reading, you can have an opinion in the subsequent discussion. So that is my best pitch. Remember, after we finish watching the pre-recorded interview, the episode will almost certainly go a little bit later than we like to, but that's okay. We had a lot of stuff to get to in the first part. Once we finish watching the pre-recorded interview with Lillian, we will be back live for the philosophy segment with Professor Burns, which we'll be for the next 2 weeks. Is teaching philosophy to Charlie Kirk, parts 1, 2, and 3. And then after that, in the post game for GTW patrons, we are going to have on John Palmucci Jr., better known to Twitter users as Gabagool Marx, who is the man behind one of my favorite Facebook pages. There's also a Twitter version, which is Socialist Sopranos memes, and is exactly what it sounds like. So we are going to be talking in that post game, as well as doing a little bit more of an informal discussion of some of the funnier things that happened last weekend. And there's also a thing about people protesting Dave Smith's comedy sets that we want to get into. But the main thing we're going to do is we are going to talk about Social Sopranos memes. We're going to look at a lot of the memes, some of which were really cracking me up, like as we were preparing the graphics for the post game. And most importantly, we are going to find out whether John liked the Many Saints of Newark. So all that stuff is coming up, so interview, philosophy segment, then we'll go to the post game and talk Sopranos. All right. Now joined once again by Lillian Cicerchia to talk about what I've been spending way too much time thinking about lately, the materialist theory of history. Thanks so much for coming back.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben. And I'm happy there are people who might be interested in the materialist theory of history. So
yeah, well, that's the hope. Nobody's just skipping past this, this interview. We'll see all right what happens at the end.
Right.
Yeah, so I think you'd actually sent me a podcast that you'd recorded, I think, for a class that you were doing, talking to Brenner about some of this stuff, and I listened to a good bit of that, and I thought that was really interesting. But I want to kind of start by taking a couple of big steps back and thinking
Oh, are you
about.
talking about the conversation I had with Robert Brenner?
Yes.
On my, oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yep. That's the one. So I do want to get to some of the stuff that's covered there, but I think probably a useful way to start this is that I think that there might be some people who, watch this or listen to it as a podcast later who, are obviously, interested enough in socialist politics to listen, and who have, and are at least inclined enough in nerdy intellectual directions that this is the podcast where they're listening to it, and have at least a vague idea that that Marx's theory of history has something to do with thinking that material something or other are have a primary role in driving things forward, but might not know much more than that, and I do want to make sure that the person I've just described, is on board. So I think that the original version, Marx's version of the theory of history, which is what G.A. Cohen is trying to capture in the book, Karl Marx's Theory of History. And, there are arguments about exactly who meant what by what. And, because of course there always are, but basically, at least certainly the kind of Engels Second Internationally kind of understanding of that theory is what you get in a particularly clear way in Cohen. So maybe a good place to start out would be by kind of going over a little bit what the, let's say again, the materialist theory of history classic is.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that there's an even more fundamental level in which you can talk about the theory of history, because when we talk about the theory of history or the philosophy of history, there's so much loaded into this, both politically and philosophically, and Cohen has, like you said, a really particular way of elucidating things that were implicit in the socialist movement for a long time. And I think it's important for people to understand that when he writes this book in 1978, the view that he is espousing as the orthodox view is already on its way out. Marxists have already seen the problems with it, and they're already contending with it, and they're not accepting it anymore, and that's why he's calling it a defense. So there's this whole background of debate, and I think to understand why you should care about this, which is a theory that not many people today agree with, it's that it's how you think about history sort of determines how your relationship to the future, what you think happened in the past and how the logic and how it works depends is going to determine something. Not absolutely, but it's going to say something about how you think you need to act and orient towards the future. And the current common sense right now is that Cohen's theory is really wrong. Mm-hmm. But Marxists think it's wrong and redeemable. It's wrong in some fundamental arguments it makes, but they don't think materialism is wrong. And they don't think that the idea of class struggle is wrong. The Marxist theory of history has progressed quite a long way since Cohen wrote this book, but you wouldn't know that. So if you go into an undergraduate seminar or you read any book about history or that dunks on Marxism in the past 50 years, you're going to see them saying things like, oh my God, how obvious that these three main points are wrong. Marxism is dead. And the problem is that there hasn't been anyone to do what Cohen did again now, given what we now know. So that's kind of how I would situate it. It's a really important book, but it's something that it wasn't just accepted at the time as the Marxist theory of history. And I think the basic idea here is that he endorsed the idea of technological determinism. Okay, and that's the idea that the technology we use in the fancy Marxian language, it's called the productive forces. Okay, the technology, the raw materials, the stuff with which we produce our lives. Mm-hmm. This is this is going to determine something about the social relationships that are going to take a certain form because of the level of technology, the level of the productive forces. And to explain how social transformation happens, the Orthodox view accepts not only technological determinism, but a functionalist explanation for social change. So if you're wondering, how do we get from one social form to another, whether it's from feudalism or a peasant-producing society to capitalism, and then maybe, and this was the hope, capitalism to socialism, you have to say, okay, at some point, the social organization, the productive relations, the organization of society, it's going to not fit so well with the existing technology. We're going to increase labor productivity so much. We're going to automate things. We're going to be pressed together into these factories, into these workplaces, and we're going to realize that we can do it better ourselves. And so then we can initiate a transformation from capitalism to feudalism. And the reason that the first two steps lead to a third step, which is teleology, okay, so is because you have to kind of think that there's an internal momentum or logic to transformation. So the three elements of the Orthodox theory of history are technological determinism, a functionalist explanation for social change, and teleology, that there's a direction to that social change.
Yeah, so let's maybe pause and try to break down some of those a little bit more. So, so the technological determinism, what that what that means is that the development of the productive forces of the capacity of a society to produce things, roughly. We can nitpick that, but let's just let that go. The capacity of society to produce things, that is the sort of primary thing that then leads to changes in the relations of production. So, whether people are peasants and lords or workers and capitalists or whatever. And then the functionalism comes in because the view is that in some way, once the development of the forces becomes a problem for relations, that causes the change in systems. And do you want to break down a little bit what you mean when you call that, just because, inshallah, not everybody listening is an academic, what you mean when you call that a functionalist view? What's functionalist about it? What does that mean?
Right. So I think the simplest way to define a functionalist explanation is that it says, so I'll say it analytically and then I'll put it into ordinary language.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that X explains Y because X keeps Y intact.
Right.
Okay, so the idea is that in this case, that the relations of production are required or needed by the system because they are going to facilitate the best use of the productive forces. They're going to be the optimal way of realizing our capacity to reproduce life. Like labor productivity is very important in this story. How many units of output can you produce with labor in a certain amount of time? And pre-capitalist societies, it wasn't very much. Now it's an astronomical amount of stuff we can make in a very small amount of time. So we have a way of organizing ourselves that is conducive to realizing the potential and the capacity of the productive forces. Peasants couldn't do it, but people in factories can, for example. So the productive relations are explained because they are useful or needed by, in other words, functional for the productive forces to realize their potential. And this is the argument Cohen spends a great deal of time in the book, a couple chapters, defending the plausibility of this argument. And I think it's probably one of the main weaknesses. But did that break it down?
Yeah, so that's good. So and all right, so we've got the first two elements. There's the technological determinism, which just means that the big thing driving all of this is the development of the productive forces, roughly technological change. So societies
Roughly,
can,
yeah.
that's the ability of societies to produce more stuff because they're producing it differently, which might have to do with technology or might have to do with with just the way things are being organized, which is the complicated part, because like that sounds like now we're talking about relations, but just the way that the actual stuff is being organized. Like Cohen has an analogy in the book where he says that in this sense, right, like it's being organized in the same way in a factory farm in Indiana and a collective farm in the Ukraine, right? Because like the actual way that the production is happening is the same. The relations of production are different, but the way the production is happening is the same. So it's the development of that way from the way it happens in family farms or whatever up until that in that example, that it's that kind of change that's
Right.
that's fundamentally propelling everything forwards. That's the technological determinism part. And then the functionalism is that there is a way in which that going forward is going to explain that the way you put it really well at the end, but I've lost it. The last little bit felt like a really nice non-technical way to say this. Can you say that again?
I might have forgot what I said as well. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah, I think that like the one thing, like if you're interested in reading more about this, like, and you want to get into some of the way Marxists argue, there are lots of little hidden functionalist arguments. This is the big one. This is like the big central theory of history, but we use them all the time, and they're usually our weakest arguments. So that's why it's good to point them out. Like when you see words like capitalism needs such and such to sustain itself, or capitalism maintain, like this is happening because it maintains a capitalist's ability to accumulate or exploit, or this ensures that accumulation can proceed unhindered. This is all, like, it's the same idea. Like when you think that basically something is happening because it's going to secure the current way of reproducing social life at what used to be called the base. So it's kind of like the social relations are the glue that enables the base to keep going. And they're like that because they facilitate that development of the productive forces. And importantly, the way that you explain change when that stops happening is at some point, according to the Orthodox theory, and you have to take a leap of faith to think this, but they thought that at some point those relations stop becoming suitable. They become Marx uses the word fetter, and Cohen will use that word too. They become a fetter on the productive forces, where suddenly it becomes evident that you could do things differently with the same level of labor productivity, with the same technology, with the same raw materials. And capitalism is the relationships of exploitation, the bureaucracy, the state, all the things we know and loathe. Like these are the things that suddenly they're going to become hindrances, and we're going to see that, and we're going to initiate a transformation to a different way of doing things. And the reason I say you have to take a leap of faith is because, well, that didn't happen in anywhere but Russia, or, and so, I mean, there's a couple other, it's right. Revolutions are disputable, but like, there's a way in which, like, you have to think, aha, it happened before, so it's going to happen again. And that's like, it happened with feudalism to capitalism. When's our next step? And that's where you start making your leap of faith, and what usually ends up being like a projection of your analytical and explanatory hopes and dreams onto empirical reality that may or may not work out.
Yeah, I like that. So I think that, right. So I mean, like the way that sounds sort of like, I think the example, obviously probably that makes this most plausible. In fact, that's probably the example, that makes it, that makes it seem plausible, is that if I talk this way, that functionalist way, that is, that, well, this set of, of productive relationships serves a function for the development of the productive forces. And I say that, in fact, I think I do say somewhere, probably in a really overly crude and way, that that like the transition from like a mostly agrarian society to having like to contemporary industrial society was facilitated by having peasants no longer be bound to the land, so they could like move around and go into cities and as different capitalist labor needs happen, they could do that. That sounds sort of plausible, and we all kind of feel like we know what it means to say that to say that. But then again, as you say, we do this all the time in the smaller contexts, and those are oftentimes like they roll off the tongue real easily, but like they but like those are oftentimes the ones that are, for very good reasons, the least convincing to people who are the least the least soaked in this way of talking, that we have whatever social phenomenon you're trying to explain, racism, whatever, that's like, well, capitalism needs that because of such and such. And anybody who's skeptical about that, the first questions they're going to ask are, well, hold on, but like what's the actual chain of cause and effect here?
Yes. What's the causal mechanism that does that? And also, like, did it, like, there's this way in which functionalism, here's my thing about it. I think that functionalism is a symptom of people who overextend a social theory beyond the limits of current existing knowledge in order to kind of group phenomena together and to generalize about things that they actually don't have the capacity to explain. And it does seem plausible. I mean, in a certain way, like, it's not like it, I don't want to be completely diminutive, because it's actually generated quite a lot of historical research, and it might be like, you might want to contend with it today, but it's not like this was a stupid idea. Like, the reason it's so, what you're saying is like, it seems sensible. Like, you think, what keeps the system going? We don't really, like, it seems like there's all of these things that make it, so for example, take racism as an example. People with functionalist arguments have historically said that capitalists need to divide and conquer the working class in order to better exploit them. So this is never convincing to people who emphasize the causation of race as an independent variable, because the answer is, why race and why not something else? Why this thing? What was the mechanism that produced this thing? But at a certain level of abstraction, it does seem plausible to say that, well, a divided working class is weaker. So at some point, this particular thing emerged and it served that purpose. So it's not a stupid argument, but it has this flaw of exactly what you said. How? And there's a leap between that abstract generalization and the knowledge required to fill it that makes it kind of circular, like you're presupposing the thing that you should want to explain, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, maybe like just on a kind of simplistic level, one way to think about this is that when you're starting to think about this stuff, if you say things like that, a very common kind of snotty response is, oh, what? Like, everybody's sitting around in a big like room smoking cigars and plotting for about how they're going to do this. That's dumb. That's like a conspiracy theory, and it feels very sophisticated to say, no, I'm not doing. I'm not doing conspiracy theory. I'm doing structural analysis. That that you don't need to have human intention. You don't need to have like conscious intention by anybody. You could just it serves this interest for the system. And I'm talking about systems and structures, and that sounds good. But there's maybe a higher level at which like the original question comes back, and it's like actually a pretty good question. Like, okay, so if there's no smoke-filled room, then you kind of like, you can't just say structure a bunch of times. Like you need to actually tell me like what are the steps by which they're serving this function for the system actually causes it to happen.
Yeah. Okay. So you're an analytic philosopher. I'm going to try an argument out on you that I've never told anyone before. Are you ready? And I feel like it might.
I'm as ready as I will be.
Tell me if it hits and if it doesn't. So you know Hempel's dilemma, right?
Yeah. You want to say what that is?
Yeah, I'll say what that is. So there's this argument in philosophy of science that everything that happens is a natural phenomena. Everything is physical. There's no such thing as a non-physical substance, an ideal substance. And if we were to just have all like a idea of ideal physics, like if we were to have all of the knowledge of an ideal physical science, like if we had worked everything out and exhausted the limits of our knowledge of physics, then we would be able to explain everything using only the terms of physics. And Carl Hempel looked at this argument and he was like, listen, first of all, that's knowledge that's currently outside the scope of we don't have an ideal physics, so we can't use it. So that sucks for us. And so what you're saying is like, it could be true what you're saying, but it doesn't matter because it's empty of content. Like we don't have that future ideal knowledge. And so like in a certain way, functionalism tends to be kind of empty. It leaves that gap that you're talking about, the how. And if that analogy makes sense, I think that's like basically the problem, that it doesn't satisfy us because we don't have the building blocks to fill it in. And even so, it's not that functionalism is straightforwardly wrong or like logically invalid or something like that. It's not satisfying. And that matters. And that's why, if you've noticed, Marxists aren't able to convince people using those arguments. They are quick to be like, well, what up? So that's kind of a problem.
Right. Yeah. So you do, and one way, I do want to get to the teleology, but I mean, one way of kind of seeing, like, underlining the problem is, or maybe just put it in a different way, is like, things happen because of specific things that like cause them to happen at specific moments in time, and things happen in human societies because actual specific people like do things at given times, right? Like if your explanation of the war in Iraq is something about, capitalism and imperialism and whatever your theory of imperialism is and all that stuff. It's like, okay, sure, maybe, right? But also this happened because like specific people made specific decisions at specific times, and Bush did such and such, and Colin Powell did whatever, and to connect that right to the larger thing, like you need to like you need to be able to explain how it is that the larger thing means that the immediate thing happens.
Yeah, I think that you said something important, which is that you have to be able to make sense of intentionality, and functionalism adopts, or functionalist explanations adopt this kind of this way of talking about human behavior that is like kind of evacuates it of human agents, like who have ideas and are doing things intentionally. They're working together, they're working apart, they're competing with one another. Indeed, sometimes bosses actually do get together in the smoky back rooms and plan like counterattacks on workers' movements. I mean, like the interesting thing about it is you said that you don't want to have a conspiratorial view, and I agree, no one wants that, but it makes you actually disavow some kind of common sense stuff. Like that does actually happen. Right. Like bosses do actually, they form manufacturers associations. Like if they face, not as much anymore because they don't face that much resistance, but when they do, they get together and they plan. And they'll plan, like, I read this great book. I wish I could the last name of the author is Kelly. It might be Brian Kelly. It's about the Alabama coal miners strikes from like 1912 to 1921. And he talks about like, listen, we like to act like, oh, it can't be a conspiracy, the bosses, but look at how these people attacked them. And they had a strategy and they were intentional about it. And you can't make sense of that if you talk about structures like, oh, it doesn't matter what the individuals involved are trying to do. So in some way, you can't even talk about like the common sense parts of it if that's your perspective. And then, yeah, so I think that's like an important thing, because really like history is driven by actual people, and you have to be able to talk about those people and why they're doing what they're doing. And the tough part, and what makes a Marxist perspective, I think, explanatorily powerful, but also more difficult than other ways of thinking about history, is you want to, and I think you can, explain how this all aggregates to being a system. Like Marxists are not individualists. We don't think it's just individuals. We want to talk about, Anwar Sheikh calls it statistical thermodynamics. Like we want to talk about, you know what I mean? So we can do that.
There is still, right, you do still want to have, like, if this is still going to be a version of a materialist theory of history, like some sense in which Vivek Chibber was on the show last week, and and he said like the like and he had some sort of like NRA analogy, people don't make history, classes make history, like you do still want there to be an important sense in which that's true, I think there is an important sense in which that's true, which is why trying to make sense of some kind of materialist theory of history, is a worthwhile thing to do, but like that, so it's going to add up to that bigger structural explanation, but like the adding up is not trivial. Like that's like you really do need a theory of that, like how
that's
it is
how you explain things, so, and that's our goal is not to kind of like feel confident that we already know. We need to be able to explain things. And I think that like, it's really odd that Marxists today can be, I'd say people are split. There's insofar as there is a Marxist little ecosystem of thinkers and activists, some people are aware that functionalism is a problem. And I think there's been a lot of progress made, but I think other people are like in a different, like there's adjacent debates. And I think some people are not as clear that this is a problem, and because they're focused on other angles of Marxist theory. And then, this is just my opinion, it gets reproduced even when there's other interesting innovations. Like in my opinion, social reproduction theory is like this. Like I'm very interested in socialist feminist social reproduction theory. I think there's a lot of strengths, explaining how gender oppression evolves. But if you don't kind of take but that's also, it's a part of a theory of history. And what I notice is that if you don't kind of like confront these problems, I just start seeing it reappear again and again and again. And I'm like, but hold on, like you guys, we did like 40 years ago. We like Lisa Vogel, she wrote the book that kind of set the terms for this. She was already aware of functionalism, but this is kind of what happens. Like the good ideas don't always get the opportunity to be fleshed out because we're not the dominant view. So we don't get so we kind of have to self-monitor. Like, are you giving the strongest possible argument, or are you?
Right. Yeah, you have to. Yes, right. If you are a distinct minority view,
right.
it's not a good idea, to just sort of rest on your laurels. It's like, oh, this seems basically right. What we mean, like we don't really have to spell this out that much, or like try to like think about how to make it persuasive.
It's tempting to like gesture.
Yeah,
we all kind of know, but the problem, do we? And at a certain point that starts to haunt you, I think, where you're like, hold on, wait, do we know? I don't know. Do you know? And then, and so that's,
Yeah. So I actually do want to go back just for a second to the Hempel's dilemma thing. So I want to make sure I understand your point about that. So the original dilemma is like, if somebody wants to say they're a physicalist about something, minds or whatever, that thing is ultimately going, like the sort of complete accurate theory of that thing is going to be in physical terms. And then you ask the annoying follow-up question, what do you mean by physical terms? And it seems like the two obvious things that you could mean is in terms of the kinds of stuff that is studied, the kinds of entities that are mentioned in the physics we have right now, or in the like ideal physics that we have, that like omniscient beings would have, or that like we have, you know, at the end of time when we figured everything out. And if it's that we could explain minds, or we could explain whatever it is we're trying to explain in terms of the entities, the kinds of entities that are like mentioned in physical theories that we have right now, then, you know, then it seems like the appropriate response is, really? Right? That doesn't seem like
No,
it, right?
Right.
Because, like, you know, how does that work, right? I mean, like, it doesn't really seem like we can, you know, explain it in terms of the stuff that we know about right now. But if you say we could explain it in terms of other stuff that we'll learn about in the future, then the whole thing, you know, you said earlier it was empty, but, you know, but just to be really clear about why, right? Why that's empty. It's like it's empty because like that's just like at that point, like physics, like, all right, so like that's like the category physical includes anything that anything that we'll ever use to explain this, you know. It's like, sure, whatever ultimately explains this will ultimately explain it. That's a super duper uninteresting claim.
Right. And, you know, to like, I think okay, maybe this analogy does work. I'm really excited about it, but maybe because Marxists have like run the gamut of all the ways they can try to fill it in. Like they've used psychoanalysis. The most dominant one is ideology. Like if we can't explain why something's happening, it's like, oh, people have false consciousness, or there's state apparatuses, repressive ideologies, or it's like psychological drives, or, you know, so we've done it all. And I think that like, it's worth wondering, you know, why things have to go in that direction. If functionalism is kind of your starting point, then there's an incentive to like mishmash and like fill things in and never quite answer the original question, which is, why are people doing one thing instead of something else? Like this is something that I think Eric Wright gets really right when he says that what you're talking about when you try to explain things is that's the question. Why are they doing this and not some other thing? And if you don't have like a kind of counterfactual hanging over your head, like, okay, yeah, why this kind of racism instead of some other kind of exclusion, you know, or why is it this kind of family form instead of something else? If you're not asking yourself those questions, then you're just going to be able to say, aha, you know, capitalism needs the nuclear family because it has to support the worker, do. And then at some point, working class marriage rates collapse, and you're like, wait, did it need the nuclear family? Maybe it didn't. Yeah, so this is, if you don't if you don't discipline the inquiry or your thoughts to think of alternative paths of development, you know, why is it this logic that's emerging in this place as opposed to something else? Then I think that's one way of not answering the question.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it seems like, yeah, maybe a way to run that is there's either we can explain things in terms of why they serve a certain function for capitalism, or a certain kind of function for the development of the forces of production or whatever. Either that means, you know, we can explain it in terms of like that directly, in which case it seems like, no, we really can't, or we, you know, or there's like a bunch of other stuff that might itself somehow be explained by that, you know, that explains it. But like the further you go in that direction, like the sketchier the connection to the original claim starts to sound.
I think so. And then when it becomes evident that it doesn't work out, then it's inevitable. Like, to me, the weaknesses of this are a part of the precursor to people like thinking that there are systems and system logics at all. Because if you can't tell a convincing causal story or have a theory of social reproduction or a theory of transformation that isn't empty in the sense we were talking about, then people are like, maybe the system's like, maybe there is no system. Maybe all of this other stuff is just happening just because, and we need to just pay attention to what's happening and not even try to explain it.
Yeah, you could all explanations are at a micro level. There really is nothing we could say at the level that, like, materialist theory of history is supposed to be pitched.
Exactly. So it attempts. So, like, for example, in the social sciences, as I understand it, there's people are focused on like small theories, like theories that don't, like, they don't do theories of history. They explain concrete things. They're not trying to overextend themselves. And I think it's a reaction to this sort of thing. In philosophy, like, we hardly talk about history at all. Like, we think it's like, might be, we think it's futile, or there is no logic to history, or history is only kind of random occurrences or dispersions, or it's not in discourse.
Well, you put this really nicely in that Brenner podcast we were talking about before, that I mean, to slightly paraphrase what you said, like, one reason maybe, like, why philosophers oftentimes aren't really that attracted to materialist views of history is that it's, like, these are explanations, like, you might have, of course, historically lots of philosophers have liked idealist views of history, and I would argue even a lot of people who don't think they have a philosophy of history basically have an idealist philosophy of history, but that's just but like everything that like lots of people who are contemporary philosophers who want to think about philosophy of race or gender or whatever, like, if you listen hard to what they're saying, it's all like they're explaining phenomena in terms of the ideas in people's heads. But, like, the point you made on there is, like, but you can kind of see why, like, there's not a lot of attraction to materialist theories of history, because this is a theory of, because then it's like either you're just not going to be interested in theories of history, or you're going to want to go in an idealist direction, because otherwise, like, what are you going to say about it? Because this is a theory of history in terms of that annoying empirical stuff that's the opposite of what you do when you do philosophy.
I'm going to put it slightly differently. Yeah. I think that the reason philosophers are not attracted to materialism is that materialism is harder. When it comes to idealism, they just have to read. And it takes a lot of time. It's a lot of hard work, but you read, you interpret, you try to find thought patterns, you reconstruct them. Okay, and it's not that that's not difficult work in itself, but what I mean by it's harder is that in order to be convincing as a materialist, you have to know what is going on. Like, that's what Brenner always says. You have to know what is going on, as it were, which means that you have to have some interdisciplinary knowledge. And not only do you have to have interdisciplinary knowledge, some basic interdisciplinary knowledge. One person can only do so much unless you're Marx or Adam Smith or one of these people who just didn't do anything but attain to certain interdisciplinary knowledge. But you have to try to learn to think like people in other disciplines, so that when you see arguments, you're able to say, this is a good argument or a bad argument, or this is better supported or not. And that's something you have to know a little bit about the different methods people are using. And that's harder. You have to have a certain confidence in the facts, because you've been able to make judgments about how to interpret them. And fundamentally, I think that's what makes materialism unattractive, because doing all of that is a lot. It's not very sound footing for a philosopher to be on. And I think that idealism just doesn't have those obstacles, and it's within your analytical power as such to be an idealist philosopher.
Yeah, I mean, to be a philosopher is to spend your time thinking about ideas. So, like, if you can have a theory of history where you just have to do that, then, like, that sounds like the kind of thing that philosophers, like, as a profession, would like more.
Yes. Yeah, I'll make exceptions. I mean, like, even the good idealist philosophers, like Kant or Hegel, they did have a lot of interdisciplinary knowledge, and that is a different time. But I just mean, like, the way things are now, like, where there's a lot of pressure to, like, think quickly, to publish, to find your niche. It's less attractive because it just feels less accessible. I think, and it requires more patience, and frankly, it's more patience than most of us have at this time. So,
yeah, well, I mean, fair enough. I've certainly spent, enough thousands of hours on Twitter that, that mine is not anything like what it used to be. But but yeah, right. Okay, so let's so actually that might be a really good kind of tie-in to trying to go from what we have been mostly talking about, which are the problems with certain aspects of, historical materialism classic, and to thinking a little bit about, obviously we can't do very much of this right now, but like thinking a little bit, so people have at least some idea of what, the improved versions might look like. And you mentioned Brenner when you're talking about interdisciplinary knowledge, and I think the way I'd like to think about it is like the overwhelming virtue of the Cohen book, even the chapters where he's like laying out exactly the claims that we've been talking about all the problems with, for the last half an hour, is that it just makes it makes the fundamental claims and arguments of the classic theory like really, really clear, so you can then subject them to some sort of empirical test, see like, okay, like as far as we can tell from looking at what actually happened, for example, and what Brenner's particularly interested in, which is the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Is this what happened, right? I mean, now that we're clear on what the claim is that it? And then it seems like this is going to be, probably the biggest problem, because once you start getting into the nitty gritty of what that transition looked like, it really doesn't seem like it's what happened.
Right. So I think that actually before coming on, I thought, okay, if I was going to say something about the alternatives, I made a little list of, so if people are interested in just pursuing, like, doing your own reading, I'd say that there's 5. And I might be wrong, so people can, I guess, chime in and say if they can think of other big categories. But I think that the next obvious place to go is to E.P. Thompson. He's much used and abused in the academy, but he made some pretty fundamental objections to orthodoxy, where he argued that an early version of saying that you can't assume that class struggle is just going to happen. Like I said, you have to ask why they're doing one thing instead of something else. He puts it differently, but I think when he has this famous quote where like he says that the working class was present at its own making, he has this thing about the self-making of the class, of class formation. I think he's trying to ask those questions. Why does that evolve specifically, in his case, in the working class in England, in the way that it did there, as opposed to in some other way? So I think that starting with Thompson, it's a difficult book, but he has debates with other Marxist philosophers. Cohen is in part responding to him. The second category is, I'd say there's 3 people: Althusser, Miliband, and Poulantzas. These are people who start trying to answer some of the holes in the orthodox theory by talking about ideology and the state. My opinion, this is just my opinion, I think Althusser doesn't overcome these obstacles. And the other 2 are significantly different enough, but they're more preoccupied with the state. So looking at other institutions aside from class struggle is one way to kind of fill in these gaps. Political Marxism, so who you mentioned, Robert Brenner and Ellen Wood. I think that when it comes to asking the fundamental questions, I think that this is the most convincing. Not because like I'm able to arbitrate all of the empirical debates, like what exactly is Robert Brenner right about, but they ask these questions in like a militantly straightforward way about functionalism, about technological determinism. And I think Ellen Wood in particular tries to respond. And I think if you want to know, like, how would you start to develop an alternative theoretically, not just like, you're not going to do what Robert Brenner did and go out back and look at the ledgers in 16th century England and see the change in the rents and the taxes. And you're probably not going to do that. But you could go back and you can look at why it's a different theoretical starting point. And then I think there's the analytical sociology tradition, in which there's Eric Wright, Klaus Offe, Adam Przeworski, I think is his name. These are people that I first read in Vivek's class, actually, and they're people who try to ask these kinds of questions in a complex capitalist society. Why don't things transpire in the teleological way? And they try to talk about other causal mechanisms. And then the last one is a little off the beaten track for a lot of Marxists, but I think Karl Polanyi is in this category. He's got a way of talking about historical development that takes capitalism seriously, but has a way of incorporating culture, what he calls society, into like the kind of specific shapes it takes in different countries. And the reason I raise that is that Wolfgang Streeck has been influential as a new theorist of capitalism, and so has Nancy Fraser. And they're both really influenced by Polanyi. And so when you think about like a meta theory, I think that he's kind of like he's influential in other, not like, I think maybe non-Marxist circles already, but I think like he's kind of having he's rolling in to like how people are thinking about capitalism, and people might be interested in that.
Yeah. So I guess one way to, without getting into the nitty gritty of all of those people, which would be like an episode at least each, I think, like kind of taking a big step back here, like one thing that might be worth emphasizing is what, like, if you go, like, if you think that, we should be a little suspicious of easy functionalist explanations, if you think that it's not really that just the development of technology and productive capacity of society by itself doesn't really explain that much about the transition between one social system and another. Maybe a certain amount of that is a necessary condition, but it's not gonna get you, to your explanation. And certainly that plus the like hand wavy functionalism is definitely not going to be enough to get you to your explanation. So if you take those criticisms, and we never really talked about teleology, but like, you might also have like worries about whether there's a sense in which there's like a sort of signal direction of march, that explains things. That if you take all of those criticisms, then I guess one thing to linger on would be what's left of the original theory.
Okay, so I love this question because now I can be a little bit more like philosophically speaking. I think that it's possible to talk about system logics without thinking that they have like a meta historical direction. Like you can talk about them as having, I think in philosophy of science, it would be called like emergent properties, like things that emerge based on a local logic. So, but to step back from that, I think that the most concrete way of talking about the economy is to stop exceptionalizing it from other kinds of social activities and behaviors. And this is something that I mentioned Anwar Sheikh before. I was listening to him some years ago, and when he started challenging the idea that there was such a thing as perfect competition in the economy, the way that neoclassical economics say like, okay, certain inputs and outputs, and there's going to be a general equilibrium. He was like, if you stop thinking about the economy as something kind of this special analytical zone, and you open it up to being a truly social phenomena, so not just an economic phenomena, like it is a social dynamic, then you get so much more room to move and to breathe as a theorist, because you can say, okay, so people are facing certain constraints. They're dependent on the labor market. They have to compete with one another. They're dependent on how many market shares they have. Capitalists have to compete with one another. How, like, and this is what Brenner calls the competitive constraint. Well, how do people think about these things? Like, what norms emerge in confronting these constraints? when they collaborate together, when they don't collaborate together, how do they think about them? What ideas do they produce? How does it shape their relationships with other people? If they're religious, does it change the religious ideology or does it adapt to it? And then you get the peculiar, forms that I think I mentioned last time I was on the show of you get American Protestantism, which is supposedly so ascetic and pious and family values. And then they're the most militant possible capitalist ideologues in the country. It's really incredible. So, likewise, in the United States, the Catholic Church is much more conservative than it is elsewhere. Why is that? And you can start saying, what are they reacting to? And this is something, and I think that if you think about it as a practice, people are actually engaging with economic constraints. And we want to know how they start to expect things of themselves in relation to others, because they expect other people to react to them in a certain way. And when you start saying, okay, I think I need to do this because I expect other people to do the same, then you're not talking about methodological individualism. You're talking about aggregate patterns, structural patterns. And then when you start asking about structural patterns, you have to say, what are people expecting? How are they articulating their needs? And how is it making them see each other? And why are they seeing each other in that way instead of another way? And the thing is that this may sound kind of messy, but I think if you actually talk about what kind of what the constraints are in any given time, then you both get the intentionality. This is what I'm reacting to. This is what I want to achieve. And then you can say, aha, there's a law of unintended consequences, because people try to do things and then they change the structure and that, in some way.
Yeah.
Then they can't always control the outcome of that. So, and then people have to react to the later challenges that those previous reactions were the cause of. And so in some sense, what Marx said, that we make history, but not of our own making, it's not just history in the abstract or these huge structures that are just so impersonal, dominating us. And we don't we're inheriting the sedimented practices and activity of other people. And I think that's how you get to talk about structure, because you can't change it as an individual, but at the same time, individuals do make, and we have ideas about them. Ideas are relevant. That's the thing that I think, and this is the last thing I'll say.
Sure.
I think that the mistake of materialists is to not talk about ideas, and to act like the ideas are somehow, they're not driving history at all, because we don't want to say we're not idealists. But it's actually the case that we can explain ideas better than they can, because we can tell you where they come from and how they change and why. And that's something an idealist can never do. They can only talk about ideas as internally self-referential to themselves. And so not only is materialism going to give you an explanation for why things are happening based on, with reference to the empirical facts, it can also explain to you better where the ideas come from that emerge alongside those empirical facts. And so I think that from this kind of perspective, Marxists have nothing to be defensive about. It's a lack of articulation of an alternative thus far, but I think we have a lot of resources to be able to do it.
Nice. Yeah, I really like, you call back to the example about American Protestantism, because, part of what got me spending so much time thinking about materialist theory of history was thinking about, sound goofy, but, comes to bear, thinking about new atheism era Christopher Hitchens, when he'd start talking about the parties of God doing this or that or the other thing, and it just really hit me that he's almost talking about it as if he believed that these ideas really were dropped onto Earth from some sort of supernatural realm. It's why did anybody think any of this stuff? Is it really? And and as you say, right? I mean, there's the Catholic Church in America, there's the Catholic Church in Germany, whatever. It's this tremendous variation. like you have these giant religious traditions that that are incredibly flexible, and why is it that a particular form of it emerges at a particular time? And if you're trying to answer that question in a way that's just totally internal to the sphere of ideas, then it ends up getting really weird.
Really weird. And in the American context, the only solution anyone has ever found is just American exceptionalism. Americans are fucking weird. That's all. That's what it amounts to. Like, how peculiar. Isn't it strange that they're so religious? Like, look at this group over here. Look at them in the mountains with their little cult. Look at the people. Why did look at the people in their abortion protests, and how strange. They're so zealous. They're so patriotic. And I think that this is true of all idealism, but in the American context, it's really dangerous because you end up just being more fascinated by the oddities of people than being able to explain why it's developing in that way. And that's crippling, because the more you say, oh, they're so conservative, they're so religious, they're so patriotic, the more you're convincing yourself that you cannot change their mind. That's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess maybe to try to say like a little bit more about, what's left even after you make all of these adjustments. You talked about like aggregate, patterns of individual behavior, which I really like, because there's like a certain kind of like right-wing, maybe libertarian, like critic of historical materialism, who makes a big deal about, well, individuals, do things, they don't, they're not part of some, some collective entity, like a class, right? It's just individuals doing things. And I reject
philosophers. This solves a couple of our philosophy of mind problems. Yes.
Yes. But then like all these same people have absolutely no problem talking about aggregate patterns, explaining things in other contexts, like when they're talking about like, supply and demand in markets. Like they think that, like in that context, of course, right? We can aggregate, individual behavior into these like big meta level, explanations that predict what's going to happen in the future, but you can't do it here. So if like the materialist theory of history, in like really broad strokes, is about explaining a range of phenomena, like, and what should be in that range and shouldn't is a huge question, but like explaining like an interesting range of phenomena that we're interested in, in ways that are not in some primary way about people just happening to have certain ideas in their heads. But that it, that can certainly be part of the story, but that explain that ultimately in terms of some kind of story that is going to be about things like, material forces, relations, and all of that stuff, and that can explain both, how we got here, right? Why we're not still living in feudalism, and also, why, and also how the possibility is created that we could get out of here, that we could go to socialism, and which is the original idea, right? This is like what Engels means when he calls Marxism, scientific socialism, that you're going to try to make use of the best social science knowledge that you have available to you in order to think hard about how capitalism came about, how it is that we could get from capitalism to socialism, and that project is still absolutely there, even if you think that a lot of the original details need to be re-examined.
Yeah, I think that it just makes it more political. Like, you have to actually make the argument to people about why they should want socialism and why it will help them. Why they should want one reform that leads to the next, or why ultimately they should want a rupture. Why should they want to take the chance of any of those things? Leave like rupture off the table. Like, why should you join a trade union? You have to start asking people why you're doing what you're doing. And I think that, of course, political organizers always knew this. I mean, I don't even believe that in the early years of like the movements for social democracy or for any other kind, I mean, what was then called social democracy, which was, not just what we now know as social democracy. I don't believe that these people didn't understand that they had to explain to people why they were doing what they were doing. I just think there's a impoverishment that happened when people became continually disempowered, when the movement started to lose momentum or was becoming kind of progressively disempowered by the 80s, and then at some point was completely crushed. Then it's almost like revolutionary faith was more useful, because why not? There was almost no one to make the argument to. I mean, when I was younger, who was I talking? I mean, I don't know. Okay. Like, who are you making an argument to? You could just say, you could just make big claims, because honestly, it didn't really matter that much. But now there's the emergence of something like a constituency, and I think that if you stop thinking about things and because we can hardly even imagine the future, let alone predict it, let alone say there's a teleology. So I think the whole thing just makes clear that the political payoff of this is, again, first, that your orientation toward the past is going to say something about your orientation towards the future. It's going to tell you some hows and whys of why you got here and suggest some things to do about it. But if you don't have a teleology and you don't have confidence that you're going to find the magic key, that if you're okay, if I screw this bolt in capitalism, take it out, then the whole thing will collapse. Okay, you don't have that anymore. Then you actually have to start thinking, and this is more, I think, philosophical. You have to start thinking about convincing people to do things, but why? And there's always a normative justification. There's a value argument, why we're doing what we're doing, what kind of society do we want? And I think that socialists did not, I guess the socialists that I have read since the late 1970s, it's full of lots of big aspirations. There's a lot of good ideas, but how to make that argument in relatable, accessible, and politically relevant terms is not a part of that repertoire. And if you don't think history is necessarily going anywhere, the only conclusion is that you have to become a little bit more politically savvy, but also existentially anxious. You should feel like we're in a hurt. We have a task to do here.
Yeah, right, exactly. So yeah, the new society isn't just sort of inevitably coming out of the birth pangs, of the old one.
Lamentably, no.
Yes, which would be awesome, but I think at this point historically we've pretty firmly established that no. So which makes the task of convincing people that they have good reasons to try to support those reforms and ultimately support that rupture that much more important. You gotta I'm just gonna be self-indulgent here and say you gotta give them an argument. So
give them an argument. Yay.
All right, thank you so much, Lillian.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
All right, that was Lillian Cicerchia, who is one of the hosts of a really good podcast people should check out called What's Left of Philosophy. Also, just a reminder, that class that I mentioned earlier, Analytic Marxism and the Materialist Theory of History, is going to be starting this Sunday at Michael Albert's online School for Social and Cultural Change. The Zoom classes are going to be on Sundays from 1 to 3 EST. That is my cat Shabaz's tail.
Our cat.
You can tell because it, even if he weren't the only cat here, it is a very distinctive crooked tail. So no mistaking that in a crowd of cats. All right. So this, for anybody tuning in for the first time, is the other Dr. Burgess, Jennifer Burgess.
Dr. Mrs. Dr. Burgess.
Dr. Mrs. Dr. Burgess, who is a philosophy professor at Georgia State in Atlanta. She was also one of the very few people who got to watch the Charlie Kirk debate.
I did.
On Friday Live. Everybody else gets to see it in a few weeks. I believe we have a banner for this. Did that end up getting made? Okay. So we will have a banner next week for this segment. Which
will Jay and Drew be making this banner?
Yes.
Outstanding.
Which is so the this is our usual end of the main show on Monday Night Philosophy segment. But for the 3 weeks starting with this week, it has a special name, which is
Teaching Philosophy to Charlie Kirk.
Exactly.
Because, man, he needs to learn some.
Yeah. I wouldn't have said this. It would have felt tacky if I'd said it, but you tweeted something which no comment about how he struck you as being a little bit like a freshman who thinks he solved philosophy. So there are a few things that came up over the course of that debate, and this is a way to kind of tease it a little bit. At the beginning of the show, we talked about the main sort of political content of the debate in terms of what was said there. But, in this segment this week and next week, the week after, before we can actually finally show it on the 25th, we are going to tease some of the philosophy content by talking a little bit about a few topics within that that our friend Charlie might stand to brush up on.
Since Ben mentioned that I had tweeted something, I here want to plug my own Twitter, which is Prof. Jen Burgess. That's Jen with 2 N's. So anyone who wants to follow me, there we go.
Yes, Jen has a brand new Twitter account for like the last week and a half or something.
Week and a half, yeah.
Yeah. So so check that out.
Because Facebook and Instagram aren't enough.
Yeah. No, the cat's tail was not a fancy new mic. That was just the cat's tail. But they've actually had a good mic for a while. But I hope the sound is better now because I got a couple of sound shields to kind of put around the mic, as well as this nice, beautiful studio lighting that you can see if you're watching this on YouTube.
We have to wear these things now.
Yes, the headphones. So we are really sprucing up the audiovisual setup. We are not going to make it all the way up to the level of what they've got going at Turning Points USA. More about that coming up in the post game. But for right now, as far as the content goes, let's get into to the first of those 3 philosophy subjects that we will be proceeding to teach Charlie about if he watches these.
Darius, the answer to that is no.
No comment. So in any case, the first one of these has to do with the Euthyphro problem. Which
is presented in Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro.
All right, well, have at it.
You want me to tell it? So Euthyphro is this dude in ancient Greek, and Socrates wants him to define piety for him. And anyway, they get around to asking, yes, that is the first time that I've attended something of Ben's. Anyway, so Socrates gets around to asking, do the gods love something? Do the gods love it because it is pious, or is it pious because the gods love it?
Yeah. And, so just to back up a little.
Are we backing up?
Just a little.
So Euthyphro was prosecuting his father for murder.
There we go.
We're backing all the way up.
Yeah. Euthyphro was this like ancient Greek prophet who is prosecuted his father, as Jen just said, for murder. And
he had left a slave in a ditch. Is that right? And he
I believe so. I think that's right. Which is actually really interesting because I think the like implied values behind this discussion are very foreign to contemporary readers. I think there's been some, positive progress, on various fronts since this was written. But at the time, like a very common objection would be, well, this is impious. That you have a you have a duty that's like a religious duty to side with your father in any sort of conflicts that might come up, and
even if your father kills somebody.
Yeah, apparently. Now, if either of our fathers are watching this, that is really not the prevailing rule in 21st century America. So.
I can guarantee that my father is not watching this.
Well, in any case, if he is, Tommy, don't kill anybody and think that Jennifer is gonna take your side automatically. But
there's football on. My dad is definitely not watching this.
Fair enough. So, but Euthyphro says that the holy is that which the gods approve of, and he has and he has some arguments about why the gods approve of his action. That part's not necessarily so important, but the important part is what Jen was just saying.
That's what I said, bro.
Yeah. Well, fair enough. So now that everybody's up to speed about
we can use the word pious, we can use the word holy.
Yeah.
Good.
Right. So yeah, and the way this translates to the more relevant context, is if you've seen any of Charlie's previous debates, the one with Kyle Kalinske, which actually I think was the best of the previous ones for my money, or Sam's. No, I don't think it came up with Sam Cedar, but Kyle Kalinske for sure, and Vosh maybe. Anyway, I know it came up in at least a couple of them. That he likes to say this thing about how there is no social contract. I didn't sign the social contract. There's
nobody said you did. What?
Yeah, that is a line he's used before.
I did. I don't know where you were that day.
Yeah, and I actually think maybe we could do social contract theory as part of our next installment in this series. But rather than there being a social contract, he says that rights come from God. And then there's a further question about what that means, that rights come from God. And presumably it's not that God is like striking people down for trying to violate your moral rights, because that more's the pity doesn't generally seem to happen.
That would be a lot of striking.
Sure.
A lot of smiting. That's how you're supposed to put it.
Well, smiting. There we go. Presumably it's, and he did say this at one point, that it's that you have these moral rights, that it's God wanting you to have them is like why morally you should have. That seems to be the idea. But then the Euthyphro dilemma comes back up. How would you rephrase it for this?
Do you have these rights because God gives them to you, or does God give them to you because they are your rights?
Yeah, right. So like,
does that sound good?
Sure. Or I think the way, and there will be one. This was already on Twitter, so there will be one little spoiler here about what went down. So
yes, I tweeted a spoiler. So everyone who's not following me really should be. You never know
what she might tweet. Exactly. So yeah. And so I asked him about this, said, okay, so do you think it would be unjust to deny people these rights because God wants you to have them? Or does God want you to have them because it would be unjust to deny them to you?
Ooh.
To which Charlie's answer, which we'll just present.
To which Charlie Kirk pulled out his binder and started flipping through the pages real fast.
No, that's not what he did. He did have a binder. We'll get into that.
He did have a binder.
We will get into that. But no, he did have an answer of sorts to this question. So what was his answer?
Why not both?
Yes.
Porque no los dos.
Charlie,
Which I've always found that meme funny because she says, why not two? Where there really is a word in Spanish that means both, as one would think. But we are so anti being bilingual around here that, nobody would know that. So, but we know dos, so that's okay.
Yeah. Charlie Kirk's answer to the youth pro dilemma was both, which is confusing because the alternatives are mutually exclusive. So I'm still puzzled over that one, but we'll think on that some more.
That's the question, Antonio. How does it work? That's like, well, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Both. No. The answer cannot be both.
Yeah, I don't. I've got to say, I'll just give a small editorial comment here and say that did not make a tremendous amount of sense to me. What's the relationship between these two concepts? Is it one because the other, or is it, that I don't. I think both is. I think in this case there might indeed be a good reason why not.
No los dos.
No los dos. Exactly. All right. We are going to be back next week for another exciting segment of teaching philosophy to Charlie Kirk. This time, maybe we can get a little bit into social contract theory and Rawls. There was some confusion about all of that. But
there is confusion in a lot of places, if you ask me. This is where you say no comment.
No comment. That is exactly what I should say. I will deliver a few comments to patrons in the post game. So we will also be talking if we have time. We are off to a late start with this about some protests at Dave Smith's comedy shows, and we are going to have a post game guest this week, and
it's not me.
Well, I mean, you can join too if you want. But our post-game guest this week, as mentioned earlier, is John Palmucci Jr., better known to Twitter users as Gabagool Marx, who is the man behind the Socialist Sopranos memes, which anybody who follows me on Twitter, but definitely anybody who's friends with me on Facebook has seen me share about 100 of those. They consistently make me laugh. So we'll share some of those memes, and most importantly, we will find out whether he liked the many saints of Newark. So we are going to sign off right there for this week.
Team Snoopy forever.
Left is best.